All right, this is the third class for Modernism, Metempsychosis, and Masterpieces. In the first class, we talked about the structure and syllabus of the course. If this is your first day in here, do note this course tends to be rated as a fairly difficult course and is based on 3 writing grades as well as attendance, which is partially filled by pop quizzes. Note that on dates where you have pop quizzes, your attendance grade for the day will be based on the pop quiz. So do make sure that you are doing your reading. Generally, pop quiz questions will be taken from the reading you were to have done the night before. They may also have been taken from lecture from the class before as well. I consider those sort of gimme questions because the expectation is that while you are in class, you're either taking notes with pen and paper. So do make sure that you have something on your desk or computer. Please do not have a phone out. Even if you take notes with phones, you want to explain to me that that's how you do it. It is hard for me to tell the difference between a phone, which is being used for text messages, and one that is used for notes. I also tend to have extra paper. So if you need extra paper or an extra pen, let me know, and I will get that to you. That said, on Wednesday, we talked a little bit about modernism. I gave you a few definitions, particularly ones from one Maurice Vive and his Ulysses in the Age of Modernism, as well as one by Harry Levin in his major work from the 1960s called What Modernism Was. But we really only covered one of the words in our 3-word title, if you don't include the and, or the commas, which are part of our orthography, not part of all orthographies. The ancient Greek, you may know, was written in all capital letters, so there was no minuscule originally. There were no spaces between words. There was no punctuation. That sort of thing was added later by Roman grammarians who themselves spoke both Latin, which is the language of the Romans, and Greek, which was the language of the elite Romans. So we talked a little bit about perspective and perspectivism, which is a philosophical notion that people do not see universally, but are bound by the perspective or the subjectivity that they embody in themselves. And this can create, or rather this is portrayed here by Picasso in these 2 wonderful works, as showing people as they do not appear in reality when you simply look at them. So for example, generally you see somebody simply in profile, just nose and a single eye, or you see them face forward. In this case, you see this person from both perspectives at once. This seems to be part of the philosophical idea underlying modernism, which is in order to revolt against the revolt, in order to revolt against traditional forms of thinking and being, one needs to be able to see in a new way. One needs to be able to see that which has not been seen before, see that which has been impossible to see before. So often, again, I mentioned this on Wednesday, students, when they're first learning some art appreciation or art criticism, sort of tend to see Picasso and more abstract artists as this person's grasp of verisimilitude and realism, like the Ninja Turtles, the great Florentine artists, Leonardo, Raphael, Donatello, and such. They don't seem to portray things quite as realistically, quite as well, we might say. And part of the reason is because there is a little bit more philosophy underlying the ideas behind abstract art, in particular Cubism, Futurism, Impressionism, which came around the 19th century. Quite small retraction. I told you about a rude and yet funny thing from maybe 15 years ago that people would say about things that appear beautiful from afar, but not as beautiful from close. I said that people call that a Van Gogh. In fact, they call it a Monet, another impressionist there. Another, well, in this case, not Dutch, but French. And so there is a wonderful Van Gogh museum in Amsterdam, whoever gets to visit. There are other beautiful museums there too. All right, so we talked a little bit about modernism, and we looked at this definition and we saw that formalism is part of it. So these authors, they think about form. We saw also that they often write in an ironic way. They use myth, which includes religion, in differing ways, not necessarily as believers, for example. So they may use mythic or religious themes simply as aesthetic tools, as tools of art, rather than as objects of veneration. In fact, you may know that this continues to be a very big deal across religions and with representation. Something you may know about one of the Abrahamic faiths, there are three: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is that Islam does not allow portrayals of their prophet, Muhammad. So about 20 years ago, the comic writers, the satiric writers of South Park, wanted to have an episode where they showed an image of Muhammad. They wanted to make fun of him. But something like this decision came all the way down to the wire. Something like 20 minutes before the show aired, Comedy Central censored them in order to keep them from portraying Muhammad, because they thought that this would be too incendiary to believers and potentially radical believers in Islam. And so the portrayal of religious individuals important to a religious tradition is something that still is very much alive. Maybe you've also heard of a contemporary author named Salman Rushdie. Salman Rushdie, who wrote the Satanic Verses, was stabbed about a year and a half ago in the eye, giving one of his very rare public appearances after having had a fatwa issued against him, which was an edict saying that all true believers of the Muslim faith are allowed to execute this man because of his crimes against religion in portraying Muhammad in a work of literature called And the Angel Gabriel to Christians and those who are Jews as well, and for portraying them in art in the way that he did. Well, I didn't think it was a very rude portrayal. I've read the work myself, and yet still there was a fatwa issued against him, and a year and a half ago he was stabbed in the eye. He wrote a work about that, by the way. He's going through surgery afterwards. It's called The Knife. Very uncomfortable work. And so to level religion down to myth is something that modernists may be willing to do, with sort of an atheist edge behind them. But that is not something that all people throughout all the world at any given time would accept, nor is it something that it can be done entirely without conflict. Just like being a very good comedian, being a good artist may cost one dearly. In any case, we talked about irony, we talked about formalism, we talked about the reflexivism of modernist art, that art upsets the idea of subject and object. To be reflexive as a verb is to do something to oneself. It's to be both subject and object. And so a reflexive artist, a modernist artist, is thinking not only about the world outside them, but also about themselves and what they are. Part of this is reflected in the sort of inward turn of the late 19th century and early 20th century towards this new frontier, even more undiscovered, with even greater depths than the ocean. Close this a little so I can use some of the board, but this is sometimes called the mind. And I think three of you put your hands up and said that you had a major that focused on the mind. I guess your mind is necessary for any major, but those who truly study the mind, maybe in philosophy, maybe in theology, but really psychology. Psychology, one of our youngest social sciences. You should know the social sciences are all about 100 years old. Anthropology, sociology, psychology, economics, they're all very young. Economics can make some claim to being a little bit older, starting with Adam Smith in the late 18th century. But even then, he was not using the sort of quantitative models that professional economists these days use, far more like a philosopher. But all that said is that, and just to return to the reflexivism piece, is that these are artists who are focusing on what a work of art is and trying to think about what a human is and what the purpose of art is. Is it to express one's own thoughts in an act of self-exploration in order to understand oneself? Is that what one attempts to do by creating art? Or is one conveying an understanding of that which is? Is one conveying an understanding of, say, one's people in Ulysses, or one's religion, one writes religious work, or one's nation, or the world itself? This is a question that is on the lips of every modernist. And then, of course, there's also the solipsistic element of this. Do these modernists get caught in a labyrinth that they can never escape from, like Dark City? You may have seen, there's some disconcerting literature and movies out that are made to create or to give one a sense of, put one in a sense of, not despair, not despondency, but to give one the feeling of, what is the term? It's leaving my mind. If you're stuck in an elevator and you have this condition, it's the worst moment of your life. Claustrophobia. They're supposed to make you feel claustrophobic to an extent because there's so much around you that you cannot escape in order to understand. Okay, you want to understand how the world is, but you're bound by your language. What language do you speak? Speak English? Do you speak other languages? Only one? What's going to be hard to understand all these people that speak all these other languages? Do you have, what religion are you? Do you have one? What about people who are of differing religions? What about where you're from? Are you just from one place? Are you from Louisiana? Are you from Baton Rouge? Are you from New Orleans? What about these people who are Californians? What about Polish people? What about people on the other side of the world? Part of the modernist concern is that people are bound by their experiences, not only just their skills, but you're bound by that which you have seen. If you've only spoken one language, if you've only seen one people, if you only know about one religion, how could you possibly know everything that exists? How could you possibly know yourself, given the fact that there are so many differing peoples and people who exist in such different, radically different ways in different times, but also in the same time? It doesn't matter whether people have lived differently in different times if you're trying to understand the essence of what a human is, right? I mean, this is the claim that's still made these days. There was some golden age during time X, and now time Y is worse. People say this all the time. In my own profession, we say this about the universe. 25 years ago, the university was wonderful. These days, we don't know about it. Have you heard similar things said about a time now versus a time then? The old traditional example in the United States is in the 50s, were the good old days. But you know what's happened in the 50s? A Cold War between the most powerful nuclear powers that had ever existed at the time. This people, if you have a parent or perhaps in your case, grandparents, now, do you know what sorts of, are any of you educated in America? Did you have American private or public educations? Yes. So you're familiar with the idea of a drill, like a fire drill, or a tornado? Any of you seen a tornado drill? Have you had a hurricane drill? Just bro, I'm just kidding. You know what sort of drill existed in the 50s? Yes.
Nuclear bomb drill.
Nuclear bomb drill. And what did you do during a nuclear bomb drill?
I think they got under their desks.
They got under their desks. Yes. And so I was making fun of, or drawing attention to the fact that this glass apparition here was supposed to prevent me from catching some sort of pulmonary illness from you during the COVID times. As if the air couldn't go around. And, this is a very performative thing. I'm safe, right? Well, you may not be a scientist, but do you think going under your desk would keep a 50 megaton nuclear weapon from affecting you in some way if it were dropped, I don't know, let's say within a mile of you? No, I mean, you'd be incinerated. You would become like a dark shadow on the wall. I don't know if you've ever seen these things. It's horrible. It might make you believe in the soul all of a sudden just to see the physical remnants of a person. Much worse than like the mummies in Pompeii or the people who scatter the tops of Everest. You know, a couple of years ago, like 30 people all died at the top of Everest in a terrible storm all at once. It's really, really bad. That's the kind of thing that always happened in Everest because there's so little oxygen at the top that in the final stage that if you just don't get back down to where there is oxygen, you will go brain dead and fall asleep and die. And that's what kills most people, not just hypothermia or something like that. It's the things that kill you without you being able to fight against them that are scariest, I would say. Having myself been a mixed martial artist in the past, I can say that it's the chokes that you don't feel choking you necessarily. Like you're just kind of choked, then your carotid arteries have been shut off, and then 3-4 seconds, you're gone. You're out. And often you wake up and you don't even know you went. So become unconscious is a scary thing. In any case, I promised you that we were going to move forward. Let's talk about the second word in this course, metempsychosis. This might have been the word that's really attracted you to this course. It's like a $10 word, not a penny for your thoughts sort of word, worth much more than that. This is a Greek word. It's a Greek word that means transmigration of the soul. Transmigration of the soul is an expression itself, Molly Bloom in Ulysses says all rocks to Leopold Bloom, her husband, when he tries to define metempsychosis with that expression. It means something like reanimation. Oh, again, I'm forgetting my term. If you've thought a little bit about Buddhism or studied Buddhism or Hinduism, what is the idea that you die and then you come back? Is there a term for that? Reincarnation. That's a good way of putting it. The idea of metempsychosis is the idea of reincarnation. So I want to suggest this to you. The second word in our course title is that tremendous tension with the first word. The first word, modernism, I told you, to some extent, argues against or rejects the idea of a human essence or form. It takes existentialism seriously, existentialism. And remember that the main idea underlying existentialism is that essence does not precede existence for a human. Existence precedes essence. This is the direction Western culture has taken since existentialism first reared its head in the late 19th century and early 20th century, too, right? You can define yourself as what it is you want to be. You can be what you want to be. You are not confined by that which you were born as, whether it be a social class, whether it be a job that your family has traditionally had, whether it be a pursuit that other people think is natural to being a human. These are things that, even if they are aspects of being a human, and there are many arguments on one side and the other, this is how a major argument becomes a major argument. This is something I think upsets young people. Some of the big arguments that we teach you about, they are big arguments because they're not settled, because they're major players on either sides of the argument who make really good points, and the issues are extremely complicated. Something you will observe as you continue to move into your adult, mature lives and take on more and more responsibilities with each other is that you're making choices all the time based on limited information. You're trying to make the best choices, but you don't necessarily, will not necessarily have 100% certainty whenever you do anything. And this is part of why these arguments are ongoing. In any case, the idea underlying modernism is that one can redefine oneself, radically redefine oneself, make oneself into what one wants to make oneself into, as if one is, there it is, tabula rasa. This is a great expression to have and include in essays. It comes from Aristotle, Greek. I'd actually be Latin describing Greek. I'd have to look at that. Yeah, but it means a blank slate. Modernism seems to believe that regardless of your instincts and your physiology and anatomy and its similarity to all of these other creatures called humans around you, that you are really a blank slate onto which anything can be written, any sort of language, any sort of values, any sort of way of being or thinking. Metempsychosis comes from the opposite direction. The idea underlying metempsychosis comes from, it is an ancient idea that you find all across the world, by the way. You find this idea in Buddhism, you find it in Hinduism, you find it in ancient Greek philosophy, you find it in ancient Roman philosophy. I'll include a couple of examples. Here in Plato was this 4th century, basically founder of Greek philosophy. There were some people called the pre-Socratics, and of course his teacher Socrates, who are very important. But really there was Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great, whom Alexander the Great would send new species of creatures to, because he knew that his teacher was a really great zoologist who loved such things. I think he sent him elephants at some point. In any case, Plato was in some ways the first philosopher. His Republic is sometimes considered the greatest work of philosophy ever written, and book 10 of it is the end. And at the end of this work of philosophy, which is supposed to be a work of reasoning, he gives a myth. Very odd. He uses myths in his work, but he describes the death of people and what happens after. Yet, at each return to the life of this world, a man loved wisdom sanely, and the lot of his choice did not fall out among the last. We may venture to affirm, from what was reported thence, not only will he be happy here, but that the path of his journey thither and the return to this world will not be underground and rough, but smooth and through the heavens. For he said that it was a sight worth seeing to observe how the several souls selected their life. There's this idea that a soul dies, and if it was wise during life, this is in Plato, this is not a Christian text, it's pre-Christian, 4 centuries before Christianity came around, that this soul could choose a new life. And if it chose wisely, it would choose a good life. And so he shows this figure Odysseus, who we'll talk a lot about during the work Ulysses, which is named for the Latin name of Odysseus. Ulysses S. Grant, for example, president and major general during the Civil War, takes his name from Ulysses, which takes its name from Odysseus. Odysseus shows up, considered the wisest of the Greeks, and he was himself a warrior who spent 20 years away from home, 10 years fighting a war, 10 years trying to make it home, bad traffic, and very low temperature, and he, though he's on the water. But that could be like being on the Gulf or after a flood. But he chooses, even after such a glorious life, the life of a simple farmer. And that's supposed to be evidence of a wise decision on his part. In any case, move a few centuries forward. So from Plato in 4th century Athens down to Rome at the height of Roman hegemony, of Roman power in the 1st century, still BCE, before Common Era, or BC. They refer to the same thing, whether you use BC AD or BCE CE. And if you're interested in those sorts of naming historical conventions, I can explain. I can talk to you a little bit about them. In any case, in Virgil's Aeneid, Book 6, a work of epic literature rather than a work of philosophy, he has his major character Aeneas, who is to be the founder of the Roman people, descend to an underworld, very like this Platonic Greek underworld, but much more filled out. And in this underworld, he observes the mechanisms by which it works. And I don't want to read this whole thing to you. I'm going to start around the middle. Let's say, therefore. Maybe I'll start a little. Okay, so hence. Hence their fears and desires, their griefs and joys, nor do they discern the heavenly light. Yeah. I'm just going to have to get into it. Nor do they discern the heavenly light, pinned as they are in the gloom of their dark dungeons. This is sort of like a hellish place. Doom, a gloomy, dark dungeon. Still more, when life's last ray has fled. Okay, these are people who have just died. The wretches are not entirely freed from all evil and all the plagues of the body. You'll see how this notion becomes purgatory in the Catholic tradition in the Middle Ages here. And it needs must be that many a taint, long ingrained, should in wondrous wise come deeply rooted in their being. This is the notion that the sins, or the vices, in this case, because it's a pagan work of literature, stain the soul. And that these stains, even after one dies, still need to be removed from one. Therefore, they are schooled with punishments and pay penance for bygone sins. Some are hung stretched out to the empty winds. From others, the stain of guilt is washed away under swirling floods or burned out by fire to a length of days when time's cycle is complete. You can see some of these ideas not only in purgatory, but the ideas of hell too. Fires burning in order to cleanse a one. And I don't like this translation using this word purgatory here because it's anachronistic, but has removed the inbred taint and leaves unsoiled the ethereal senses, beautiful language, even though translated, and pure flame of spirit. Each of us undergoes his own purgatory. Then we are sent to spacious Elysium, the so-called Elysian fields of the pagans, their version of heaven. A few of us to possess the blissful fields. All these that you see, when they have rolled time's wheel through 1,000 years, the god summons in vast throng to Lethes River, a very famous mythological river based on the Greek word lambano, which means forget. It makes one forget one's sins, so that their memories effaced, they may once more revisit the vault above and conceive the desire of return to the body. Okay, so I've read sort of long, ancient quotes to you and mentioned this term metempsychosis and said that it is in tension with the first word and the title of our course, Modernism. What is the tension exactly? Did any of you see it yet? Yes?
The idea of the metempsychosis that you kind of, the soul is like important to and this idea of coming back to it and having these decisions after life that are affected by what you did in your life. And then the modernism seems like it doesn't think about grand consequences. Consequences.
That's good. That's a good start. What, some other thoughts? What is the tension? You don't have to be 100% right in this field. We're all getting at it as far as we are getting. Yes.
That your life to an extent is predetermined, whatever it is. Whereas in modernism, the idea that you can become whatever you want to be.
I think these are excellent, excellent. Does anybody have maybe a last thought to bring it all together? So I mentioned this term, this is good, teleology last time, and that's the study of the ends. Telos means, remember how end is a word that is both physical, tangible and intangible, physical and metaphorical, right? Like something ends, it's a real end, but you come to your end, right? Or you meet your end, or you reach the end of your potential, as it were. What your end is could be, say, death, or it could be the thing that you wish to achieve, right? Like you want to write a great piece of literature. So is your end, the exact moment at which you die, or is it the thing towards which you strive your every waking breath? Teleology assumes the idea of an essence. In order for there to be a study of the end of human, then there must be something universal about humans. Something universal that is in every single human that they wish to fulfill or strive to. You can see that this undergirds a lot of philosophy in most religions, too. Okay, so there's a universalism that is part of teleology, which metempsychosis must assume. The idea of reincarnation, too, and I apologize for doing harm to this, is kind of like this, right? These circles. And this one kind of looks like this. Maybe this one, this. There are small differences, but what is similar between these 6 objects? They are all what? They're all circles. They're all figures. There's a similarity, a sameness. Even though there are differences between them, they come at different times. They're in different spaces. They're filled in differing ways. But there's something essentially same about them. Well, modernism comes by and says, well, you're a square. I'll be the square. You're some sort of diamond. You're this kind of weird thing that has a lot of edges. You're a slash mark. Let's see, you're an eyebrow, and you're some glasses. What is similar between those? It's at least a level of abstraction up, right? These are all geometric objects that are circles, close enough, but with some differences inside. These are all very different objects themselves. So modernism seems to take very seriously the idea that there may not be a teleology that is universal to humans. That, in fact, your teleology may be individual to you entirely. It's almost as if modernism wants you to take seriously the idea that you might be, and there's an excellent Latin expression, sui generis. We say one of one these days, but this is the highest register way of saying one of one. Sui generis, generous, genus, kind. Sui, of itself, one of a kind. That's what sui generis means. So modernism might have the effect of making you feel a little claustrophobic, a little bit alone, a little bit despairing, and that you might be the only sort of creature like you in the universe. And it may be your responsibility to figure out what it is you are in order to articulate it to others. So there is a tension between these ways of looking at the world, one in which something universal and general continues to be repackaged and retransmitted over and over and over, and one which offers a way, so it claims, of upsetting that which has been offered, that which is traditional, to revolt against it, to make something truly new. You might consider that the ultimate goal of modernism, to create something new. And depending on what your philosophical religious beliefs are, you may not believe in that. Any of you readers of Ecclesiastes, one of the great first quotes of Ecclesiastes, you've almost surely heard it before. I'll start it for you, see if you can finish it. There is nothing blank, 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 blank. This is a great quote. You want to know this quote. There is nothing new under the sun. This seems to be the claim of transmigration of metempsychosis. But this does not seem to be the claim of modernism. All right. Well then, let's look at masterpieces. We have a third term for this course, masterpieces. This term also sits in uncomfortable relation with the first two terms, but particularly the first one. The idea of a masterpiece, just colloquially put, is that it is a work of art of supreme value, regardless of its place of origin, its time of origin, the religion or the religious or economic underpinning of it, and also the language in which it is written. This matters. Why? There are two other categorical systems or two other terms that are often used in conjunction with this category. The masterpiece, as defined by Harvard Harvard comparative literature professor David Damrosch. There's both there are masterpieces, works of world literature, and classics. You may have heard of classics before. You may have heard of modern library, classical library. You may have heard of classical music. You may have taken a course with one of our professors, Dr. Watanabe or Dr. Chris Fletcher, in our classics department here at LSU. The word classic tends to mean, or rather one of the dictionary definitions of it, which are not always my favorite definitions, so I'll share a better one in a moment, is the representative ideal. So classical Arabic is considered the highest level Arabic that can be read and spoken. Classical Greek is considered the highest level, most difficult level of Greek that one can learn. A Coca-Cola classic is considered the standard Coca-Cola. All others are derivative of it. So there is a notion within the classic, like within the masterpiece, of high quality. You know, where you say that's classic. I don't know if people even say that these days. Have you ever heard somebody say that? And maybe an older person these days, like that's classic, or even adding the indefinite article, that's a classic, or that was a classic. And when we say that, we tend to say that was, that was when this person was most being themselves. This is a most illustrative example of what this person was all about. So if you were to say making fun of me after being in like 20 of these classes, you might do this and lean back and be like, that's Schmidt. And it's like, well, you're probably right. You're probably right. But there's a problem with the definition of classic that makes it non-inclusive to our aims. What does that mean? What do I mean? It has been co-opted by an academic department to mean exemplary works of ancient Greek and Roman literature. So classics really go from like the 8th, 9th century BCE to, I don't know, 4th, 5th century CE, around the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And so most of the time, when one appropriately uses the term classic, one is referring to a work of Greek or Roman literature. Well, why is that a problem? Well, if we're considering works of high value that are not written in ancient Greek or in ancient Latin and are not from Rome or Greece, then what do we call them? Because if they're not classic, well, we need a more expansive category. Well, what about world literature? Well, the problem with world literature, as opposed to classic and masterpieces, what is it lacking? What is it sure to lack? If I say this is a masterpiece or that is a classic, there's something in those terms that is missing from saying that's a piece of world literature. Something essential. What is it? If I say this is a masterpiece, or this is a classic, I have included an evaluation. If I say this is a piece of world literature, what evaluation have I not included in what I have said? Yes? I'm not speaking to the quality of it, right? World literature is easy to define. It is literature. Well, let's see. I've got it right here. A work enters into world literature by a double process. First, by being read as literature, is important. So a cooking recipe from, say, India that you read in a Cookbook is not necessarily literature because you're reading it as a cooking recipe, not as a piece of literature. If you're reading some work of the Vedantists or something like that, that may very well be a piece of work of world literature. Second, by circulating out into a broader world beyond its linguistic and cultural point of origin. So this means that world literature is translated and translated into new languages and often translated into new times. For example, every single work that we are reading in this class comes from a time not our own. The closest one to us is 100 years removed from us. And I believe 4 of the 6 of the novels are in fact translated not only through time, but also through language as well. Spanish to English, German to English a couple times, Russian to English as well. And so that changes the work. But to be world literature simply means to be read as literature and to then be translated and move out into the world beyond one's cultural constraints. Something probably it seems to you, based on the fact that most of what you've read or seen to be read comes from big box stores like Barnes and Noble or Books A Million or even Borders. Probably it seems like basically every famous book, probably you've mostly seen only famous books that are put forward by publishers that are not self-published. Probably you think most of them, if not all of them, have been translated into basically every language where bookstores exist. I'll tell you that most people only know about a very small percentage of books that have ever existed. And of those books, only a very, very, very small percentage of them are ever translated. Almost everything written in almost every language remains untranslated and disappears. In fact, if you do become a classicist, a big problem you'll run into is that there's almost no evidence for anything. Why? Because the time you are studying is like 2,000 years old, and you have to dig through the ground in order to find small evidence for the things that you are looking for, because preservation is extraordinarily difficult. One thing as myself, a scholar, is that almost no scholarly work is translated. So anything I write in English, I would have to translate myself into other languages, or other scholars would have to learn English, which they often do these days. It happens to be lingua franca at this moment in time. But almost none of your professors who all write, almost none of their work, unless they get to becoming the creme de la creme, the cream of the crop, the cream of the cream, even is what that means, will their work be translated. So have your work be translated, even though it may only be a piece of world literature rather than a masterpiece, is still the level of honor that almost no authors ever experience, though some do. So, what is a masterpiece? A masterpiece, obviously, since it's not a classic, can be ancient or modern. It also doesn't need to have had foundational cultural force. There is a genre of poetry called epic poetry. And these epic poems, 4 great ones, or 5 great ones with the 4 authors, are the Iliad and the Odyssey from the Greek tradition, the Aeneid from the Roman tradition, the Divine Comedy from the Italian tradition, and John Milton's Paradise Lost from the English tradition. These are works that are often seen as having foundational cultural force, in that the work of Greek epic literature brought together 3 dialects of Greek, Dorian, Aeolic, and I'm forgetting the third one at this moment, but it doesn't particularly matter, and created a single language. Virgil, when he wrote the epic, the Aeneid, most elites spoke in ancient Greek at that time, but he wrote a work in Roman Latin, which became a standard Western language for the next 1600 years or so. There's a lot of work written in Latin. It's been a big part of history at this point. Dante's the language in which he wrote his Divine Comedy was a dialect of Italian called Tuscan. There was no Italian language. It was Latin, and there were derivative versions of it that were spoken by people. In fact, when he's referred to by souls throughout his afterlife, he is called Tuscan. Comes from an area called Tuscany, but there was not yet a unified singular language. So certain pieces of literature and art are considered so powerful that they unify a people by creating a shared story and language. That is what makes a piece of epic literature. And it is a very powerful claim. In fact, I'll tell you one thing about epic literature, is that during times of war, it is often used for propaganda. For example, Dante's Divine Comedy, during the times of Italian fascism, was used as an example of how Italians should become unified. The whole idea of fascia, by the way, is a bunch of sticks that are together that cannot be broken together. There are fascia in the claw of the eagle on the dollar bill, in his left or right, the spread eagle, that's what that's called, and they look like this, you know, or like a dragon like this. It's called spread eagle. And in one of his claws, there's a bunch of arrows, fascia. You have those in the bottom of your foot too. They're named that because of the And so, does not have to have, a masterpiece does not have to have foundational cultural force. Does not have to come from a certain place, does not have to come from a certain time, and can be translated. One thing that I'm just going to say to you, and think about it what you will, is that traditionally, at least in the West, let's say at least from the 19th century on, but really from earlier than that, the idea of a college education was that it was a part of an elite education. It was part of going to a prep school and then to college, and then sometimes going on with one's studies. One generally studied Latin and Greek stories, the Latin and Greek language, and then at university, our university is kind of strange when we're an agricultural and mechanical college, right? These are not the original sorts of colleges. Original universities only had 3 courses of study: theology, medicine, and law. And these were the only 3 things that one could study. And theology was also sort of philosophy as well. So we're very different as sort of a practically minded place of study. But with the idea of elite education came the idea of elite subjects and elite subject matter. And so in order to be an elite, you need to learn one's Latin, you need to learn one's Greek in order to be able to read classics at the university level. So you had to know Greek and Latin. If you ever look at the old Harvard entrance exams too, you might see that they're very, very difficult. The level of math that you need to know too, often very high. You can still find these sorts of things. I could post one on the Moodle page just to scare you a little bit. It's like 13 pages, and often, you know, university professors have a lot of trouble with that sort of exam these days. And I certainly have trouble with parsing it. But the difference between a masterpiece and a classic in this respect is that you can read masterpieces in your own language. You can read them in translation. There is not the requisite elite ideology underlying the notion of a masterpiece. It doesn't need to come from a certain time, nor a certain place, nor does it need to be read in a certain language in order to be a masterpiece. And so sometimes the idea of the masterpiece is called, a word that I used to describe myself last class, called a little more bourgeois. If I can get this right. My French, this is the Burge. I'm not even going to put it all up. That's in the letter there somewhere. If I were to put the bourgeoisie in there, it is written here too, but that law. In any case, bourgeois is the French word that is itself a translation of the German word Berg, or the Burger. Burgermeister means, say, mayor, or the big man in a place. A burg is a city. A bourgeois individual is a city dweller. And so instead of being on our manors, out as feudal lords reading our Greek and Roman classics, now people tend to, particularly elites, tend to live within cities. Cities in which they speak languages that are not from remote times and remote places with other elites, but with all the people around one. And so the idea underlying a masterpiece is that it is more of a bourgeois, middle class concept. It is more inclusive of titles. It is more, it is easier to read or to access a masterpiece than it is a classic, right? You need to know some Latin or Greek to read an old Greek or Latin classic. Did any of you read Greek or Latin? And so that'd be pretty tough to do at this point. Danny, do you read English? Well, there's some nods. There's some nods. Let the record know there's some nods. And you're right. You might not feel like it during some of these texts because they're a little bit wild and difficult to read. And yet it would still be harder to read in literally a different language. So masterpieces are not only at tension with the notion of modernism, and that there is something of value that can be ascribed or derived from each of these texts that I am ostensibly teaching you and that you are ostensibly reading, but it is also at tension with the notion of classics. Classics is an elite concept. Classics is a static concept. Can there be a new classic? I mean, no, unless like Greece or Rome come back to prominence and start writing. Even then, it would be like neoclassics, right? It wouldn't be the same time. It wouldn't be the same place. It's a static concept that has all of the works that will ever be in it, except for that which we still need to find underneath the ground in the around the Mediterranean, which still happens all the time, by the way. You need money to do that, and so everything has not been excavated from the earth, certainly not. And so classics, or the idea of a classic, is something of a dead, old idea, whereas the idea of a masterpiece is a living idea. You can have masterpieces on into the future. You can have masterpieces in languages that we do not yet speak and yet know. This concept is a concept that has come to be and may very well continue to evolve as culture evolves, as people evolve, insofar as you take the notion that we evolve seriously, which you don't really need to do for the purpose of this course. It's not a biology course. All right. That's everything I want to say to you today. All right. Make sure that you are checking the syllabus and that you are here on Monday. Remember,